What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our waiver wire must adds for week 15 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, starting things off at the running back position, we're going to take a look at CHUBA Hubbard, sitting at 39% rostered according to the Sleeper app. CHUBA finished with 18.9 fantasy points in week 14 against a very bad Seattle Seahawks run defense. 14 touches on the ground, 74 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, and 3 receptions for 25 receiving yards. A nice fantasy day overall with 18.9 fantasy points. The second time that CHUBA has hit double digits on the season. It's worth noting on bye week in week 13, but in week 12, CHUBA still had 65 yards on the ground. Not really a good fantasy day with 6.5 fantasy points, but once again, for the second start in a row, he's had 14 or more rushing attempts and at least 65 rushing yards. We'll face the Pittsburgh Steelers in week 15. Not the best matchup in the world, but also not the worst matchup. And when we look at D'Onta Foreman, he still leads this backfield in touches. 21 touches in week 14, 74 yards for Foreman on the ground. And in week 12, 24 touches for Foreman, 113 yards on the ground. But at the end of the day, the Panthers are running the football enough to make CHUBA Hubbard a productive fantasy player. He's still seen enough volume overall in this backfield to be a player that we consider here at the end of the fantasy season. So while it's not extremely pretty when we look at the running back additions for the week, I think that CHUBA Hubbard is probably the top addition as we approach week 15. All right, next up, we've got ZONOVAN Knight sitting at just 57% rostered. Knight has obviously been a waiver target over the last couple of weeks, but moving into week 14, a lot of fantasy managers, including myself, were a little bit worried about Knight's fantasy output with Michael Carter coming back from his ankle injury. But Michael Carter had just 5 touches. Worth noting, he had 6 targets, but overall Michael Carter struggled against the Buffalo Bills in week 14, where ZONOVAN Knight had another good day both through the air and on the ground, but more notably in week 14 on the ground. 17 total touches, definitely led his backfield in touches, 71 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown. He added 2 receptions as well, netted 15.7 fantasy points. At this point in the season, moving into the fantasy playoffs, where the Jets hold the most favorable playoff schedule at the running back position, ZONOVAN Knight needs to be rostered in far more fantasy leagues. Sits at a pretty high number at 57% overall, but that needs to be higher. He's going to face the Detroit Lions, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Seattle Seahawks to finish the fantasy season. He is a must-add player if he is available in your respective fantasy league. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position. We talked about DJ CHARK in the last 2 waiver wire videos. He sits at 54% rostered. He had a season high of 21.4 fantasy points against the Minnesota Vikings in week 14. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 94 receiving yards, and a touchdown for CHARK. We'll get the Jets, the Panthers, and the Bears to finish out the season. But when we look at this Lions offense, there's just no reason whatsoever for the Lions to take the foot off of the gas with this passing attack, with this offense who's looked good the last couple of weeks whatsoever. The Lions are in a potential playoff run. They are going to be competing in game after game, giving it everything that they have. So I think that DJ CHARK is going to continue to be a very productive receiver to finish out the fantasy season. Even if the next 2 matchups are a little bit steeper, facing the Jets and the Panthers, ultimately he will get the Chicago Bears in the fantasy championship. And with what we've seen the Lions do the past couple of weeks with their passing attack, DJ CHARK needs to be a player you are considering adding if he is available in your fantasy league. All right, sticking with the Lions passing and receiving attack, let's talk about JAMESON Williams made his debut in week 13 against Jacksonville, but only netted 1 total target. This past week in week 14 against Minnesota Vikings, only had 2 total targets, but one of them went for a 41-yard touchdown. Need to continue to monitor Williams' usage. Obviously, 2 targets in week 14 and 1 target in week 13 is not exactly what we want to see. But like we just talked about with DJ Chark, this Lions offense is going to continue to be very productive through the passing attack. I know a lot of you guys have rostered Williams on IR throughout the season. I know a lot of you guys added him in the last 2 weeks. But if you were kind of looking for an upside flex type player to bring some boomer bust potential to your roster, Williams sits at 49% rostered according to the Sleeper app. He is definitely a player to consider as well as we approach the end of the fantasy season. All right, let's talk about a Houston Texans wide receiver and Chris Moore, who sits at 4% rostered according to the Sleeper app. He had 22.4 PPR points in week 14. When we look since week 7, he's actually finished with double digits 3 out of his 7 performances. So I do think, overall, while it's a really ugly addition at the moment, Chris Moore is worth considering, especially for you guys in deeper fantasy leagues. At the moment, Brandon Cooks is banged up and Nico Collins is banged up. That makes Chris Moore your wide receiver 1 for arguably the worst team in the entire league. But we need to take a strong look at the Texans roster to finish the season. They get the Chiefs, the Titans, and the Jaguars. It's an extremely favorable strength of schedule for the wide receiver position. So if Chris Moore is going to finish the season as the wide receiver 1, or even if he carves out enough of a consistent role within this offense, he's definitely worth starting in deeper PPR leagues just due to the matchups alone. So once again, this is a deep add, but I do think with the production we saw out of Chris Moore in week 14 and the matchups coming up, he is a player that we need to at least consider as we approach week 15. Let's talk about Richie James with the Giants. We've talked about him in recent waiver wire videos, and things got a little bit quiet with that 5-point performance against Washington, a little bit disappointing. But overall, when we look at the last 4 games for Richie James, 3 touchdowns in his last 4 games, 13 or more fantasy points in 3 out of the last 4 games as well. 19.1 points against the Philadelphia Eagles. I get that his touchdown came in complete garbage time from a backup quarterback and everything, and it came against essentially backups for the Philadelphia Eagles. But nonetheless, the production has been there in the last couple of weeks. In the coming weeks, he'll face Washington and Minnesota, and then Indianapolis in week 17, the fantasy championship. So we want to look at those 2 matchups against Washington and Minnesota, which are far more favorable as opposed to the fantasy championship. If you guys are in need of a flex option, I do think that Richie James brings some potential to the table. We've seen enough of a consistent pattern here that James, who sits at 19% rostered, is a player we can consider as we approach week 15. All right, you guys know I have to talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones week in and week out. He has made the waiver wire video every single week since like week 5 of the season. It's kind of a running joke here at the channel that I can't make a waiver wire video without Donovan Peoples-Jones, but I do want to seriously talk about how last week, like I said, it was the last week we're talking about DPJ. He sat at 65% rostered according to the Sleeper app. He's only gone up 1% at 66% rostered according to the Sleeper app, and he just had a season high of 19.4 fantasy points against the Cincinnati Bengals. 12 targets, 8 receptions, 114 receiving yards for DPJ. So we get a little bit of a boost of confidence with the chemistry now that we've seen it between him and Deshaun Watson. They will face the Baltimore Ravens, the Saints, and the Washington Commanders to finish out the season. Not exactly the worst defenses there, but also not exactly the best secondaries. Overall, these teams have been pretty shaky when it comes to guarding the wide receiver position from a fantasy standpoint. So all I'm going to say is DPJ just needs to be rostered, especially in full PPR leagues and far more fantasy leagues. Go on and grab DPJ if you're in need of a flex option as we approach week 15. All right, Evan Engram went absolutely crazy in week 14 against the Tennessee Titans. He was a tight end who we liked as a streaming option coming into the week. It was on last week's waiver wire video. He sits at 59% rostered. And overall, when we look at his last 2 performances, 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. I mean, 39.2 fantasy points against Tennessee, 15 targets, 11 receptions, 162 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Was just an absolutely crazy performance for Evan Engram. He's definitely going to regress as we approach week 15, and he draws a much tougher matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. But with the absolute wasteland that we have at the tight end position in fantasy football right now, and Engram sitting below 60% rostered, at this point, he's a tight end we can pick up and just start for the remainder of the fantasy season, because the questions I've been getting over the last couple of weeks at the tight end position are just absolutely ugly. We know that Engram holds the trust of Trevor Lawrence. They'll face the Cowboys, the Jets, and the Texans. Not exactly the most favorable strength of schedule, but the volume should be there for Engram in the closing weeks of the season. All right, let's talk about CHIG OKONKWO, who is a player that I wasn't exactly 100% certain of starting moving into week 14, and he absolutely proved me wrong. 18.5 fantasy points for CHIG, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 45 receiving yards, and a touchdown after having 10.8 fantasy points in week 13 against the Philadelphia Eagles and 6.5 in week 12 against the Cincinnati Bengals. He sits at 23% rostered. He gets the Chargers in week 15 and the Texans and the Cowboys. Once again, not the most favorable strength of schedule, but the tight end position is just dirt ugly right now. If CHIG is available in your league, which he probably is, he is definitely the tight end who holds the upside right now. Even with Austin Hooper finishing with 11.8 fantasy points for the Texans, I think that we go with kind of that upside play and consider CHIG as we approach week 15. All right, let's finish off the video with a couple of streaming quarterback options for you guys as we approach week 15. Jared Goff was the #1 quarterback we considered moving into week 14 based off of last week's waiver wire video, and I say we just continue to ride the hot hand of this Lions offense that is absolutely humming right now. The passing game looks good, and most importantly, Jared Goff looks good. No turnovers again for Goff in week 14, 330 passing yards, 3 touchdowns through the air, 26.1 fantasy points for Goff. He is playing really good football right now. He gets the Jets in week 15. Not the best overall matchup, but I say we continue to ride the momentum of the Detroit Lions passing attack and of Jared Goff overall. He's playing very good football. All right, Brock Purdy, the first rookie quarterback to beat Tom Brady in his first career start. 21.7 points for Purdy against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 185 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and a rushing touchdown as well. He'll face the Seattle Seahawks in week 15. Not necessarily the best defense, but really not the worst defense also. But at the end of the day, the Seahawks struggled against the Panthers this past week. So I think that Purdy is in a good position to have another good stat line. I don't know if he'll necessarily get you over 20 fantasy points, but I think 16 to 18 fantasy points, a pretty safe floor, is definitely reasonable for Brock Purdy as we approach week 15. Outside of that, Mike White dealt with a rib injury in Sunday's matchup against the Buffalo Bills. We saw some Joe Flacco action out there, but ultimately, if Mike White is good to go against the Detroit Lions, I do think he is still a quarterback we can consider streaming moving into week 15 just because of his ability to throw the football. And with the matchup against the Detroit Lions, I think that Mike White, as long as he's healthy, should be in line for a pretty safe floor as well as we move into week 15. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. And of course, let me know who are you targeting as we approach week 15 in the first round of the fantasy playoffs for a majority of you guys. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.